This week on Quadriga, Mediterranean mass grave. Is the EU to blame? In the last 10 days alone, hundreds of migrants died trying to reach Europe from Africa, fleeing from war, terror, and economic deprivation. Critics say the EU is guilty of a criminal failure to provide assistance and rescue to those in need at sea. The EU has responded with a plan of action and promises more assistance. But does the bloc really want to help refugees, or does it only remain determined to keep them out? Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. This certainly is not the first time that migrants have died nearly within sight of European shores and that has produced a public outcry. So will this latest tragedy really prompt Fortress Europe to look for workable solutions? That's what we want to talk about today on the program with three people who have been following matters here very intensively. Johannes Leithäuser writes on German politics and European and foreign affairs for the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung. Daniel Gerlach is the founder and editor-in-chief of Zenith. It's a German magazine focusing on politics, economics, and culture in the Middle East. And Houssam Aldeen is a Syrian journalist who has been living in exile in Berlin since late 2012. He was a documentary freelance filmmaker in his own country. Houssam Aldeen, you also have been working with refugees, other refugees here in Berlin. Tell us something about their stories, about how they got here and what they were leaving behind.
Well, I was working, we are like founder of a small association, it's called Salam. We are helping like refugees with their problems, and we get the stories, of course, how they get here, some of them walking, crossing the sea, whatever. I mean, why we have to go so far, actually. My parents, my mother and my sister and my brother also too, they crossed the sea also. I was against that, but we don't have another solution. I tried a lot with the authority here to bring them like legally, but they refuse as usual because of the, German law. But with my mom and my sister and my brother, it was very difficult for them to live in Jordan, and then they moved to Lebanon, from Lebanon to Turkey, Turkey to Algeria to Tunisia, Tunisia, Libya to Italy, and from Italy to Germany. It was a long, long way and very difficult to describe it. It's very hard, and it's.
You say they came by boat. Did they work with human traffickers to get the boat ride, and were they in danger?
Of course they were in danger. They were somehow very lucky, because after 5 hours and a half exactly, the Italian military, they saved them, to be honest. Normally it gets like between 14 hours to 20 hours to get very close to Sicily or like Lampedusa, and they were quite lucky because of Italian military there around, and they saved them. But when I met my family in Italy, I couldn't recognize them. They were in shock. Their faces, they have a big, huge fear. They still they don't understand what's going on, that they're alive, because they were almost dying there.
Daniel Gerlach, tell us a bit more about who is on these boats. And of course, more have been coming since last weekend's tragedy. Do many of them have the kind of stories that we've just heard Houssam Aldeen describe?
Well, I think there is a general prejudice about refugees and about the nature of these refugees in Europe, which is that there's some kind of a very poor, obscure mass of people that are trying to invade our wealthy countries, and that they bring nothing but a desire to live here. This is not true.
And a desire for jobs.
And a desire for jobs. Well, these people many of them are very qualified. I have met earlier, like much earlier than this, than the current crisis emerged, people from Western Africa. I met them in Morocco who had been shop owners, who had been business people, and they had sold their businesses, and they had used all this money they gave it to the smugglers to come to Europe. I heard of the nephew of the former Algerian president who died in such a boat accident in the Mediterranean. And when we look at the Syrian people, of course, yeah, thank you for your testimony, because these are people, your relatives, people we know. And I think this is, our perspective is changing now, because we all of a sudden see, we come to know these people, and we identify them, and we know more about their stories. And I think it makes, even though the situation is becoming more and more dramatic, we more and more understand the individual reasons why they come.
Do we, Johannes Leithäuser?
I think we do partly. I don't think we are aware of stories like the one you just told, that people are just traveling around the whole Mediterranean, ending up in Libya, because there you have nobody able to control the borders and trying their luck from this country. We would think Syrians would try to flee perhaps to Europe or to Germany via Turkey and then go on over land, but not the sea. I think we think Africa when we think of these refugees still, and that meaning sub-Saharan people coming from Somalia, maybe Eritrea or other poor countries, Nigeria now, trying to go to get into Europe. And in Germany, maybe that's a bit of a special case, because we still have taking refugees is connected to this question of being prosecuted politically for political reasons. So that
political
asylum would include the Syrians, but would exclude people fleeing because they don't have any possibility to earn their livelihood in the countries they are coming from.
Houssam Aldeen, what's your sense of whether people here, not only in Germany, in Europe, understand the background and the story of the people who are coming to their shores?
Well, unfortunately, there's not much experience about that, but I would like to mention that the European Union, that they're talking a lot about the human rights. People, they are mentioning that, talking about that, but they don't really care about the news. There's a lot of people, they don't know where's Syria, they don't know where's Libya, they don't have any knowledge about those people, for example, unfortunately. So we are talking a lot in the media, but people, they are not really interested to know about it, unfortunately.
Daniel Gerlach,
I disagree. I really have to disagree here, because we can see, if you look at our media, until 2 years ago, let's say, we only saw clips of boat disasters in the news for a couple of seconds, and that was it. But in 2013, you could really see a surge in the media representation of the refugee issue. You would see more primetime stories about individual fates and about individual stories. And I really have to say, I don't want to praise our media too much, but I have to say that it makes the front page stories every time, and not only if they are disasters, there are entire weeks in which television and newspapers report about the issue. So I don't agree that there is ignorance in Germany alone. I really have to
I'm not talking about
credit
Germany, about Europe, whole Europe, for example, UK, France, the Scandinavian country, not only Germany actually, but about Germany, maybe they're more focusing about Spain, Italian, or Greece problem, economics problem, but not so much about Middle East or Africa in general. And about Syrian situation, just there's a lot of people, they don't know exactly what's happened, what the story. It's a civil war, it's a revolution, it's what kind of fight there? It's only ISIS there, only rebels or terrorists? A lot of people, they don't have any idea what's going on exactly.
Johannes Leithäuser, even if the media are telling the story, certainly we're not seeing EU immigration policy become more empathetic. If anything, it seems to be hardening. After the Lampedusa tragedy 18 months ago, many people will remember that Italy instituted a program called Mare Nostrum on its own watch, which was basically a search and rescue project. And I gather that your relatives' boats were intercepted by the Italian Navy, partly because of that program. That was around that time. The fact is, Mare Nostrum has been terminated and replaced by a new program called Triton, and it is exclusively a policing and border control program. It is not search and rescue.
Exactly, and the ships are now no longer going towards the southern Mediterranean shores, but keeping themselves on the northern part. So they wouldn't spot many refugees in small vessels, not being able to make the journey and might be drowning without our knowledge even. That has changed, and this development came about because the other European countries were not willing to pay their part. Italy said at a certain point, look, we're doing this now on behalf of the whole continent or the whole union, but we can't afford to pay for it alone all the time. And that's part of the problem. We so many times say Europe, but Europe falls apart if you take a closer look into countries that are affected by certain problems. They have to deal with it. And others are taking a more laid-back position, say, look, okay, you're there, you're dealing with this, but we have different things to look after. So this will now be changed, I'm sure, after this tragedy that recently occurred.
Will it, Daniel Gerlach, and should it? We do have foreign ministers meeting right now to talk about the problem. Would reinstituting a search and rescue program save lives of people like the ones who perished last weekend? And should search and rescue be at least the beginning of a solution?
Well, it needs to be revived, and I think it's going to be. And if you look at the budget that is needed, it's ridiculous compared to all the other endeavors that Europe is doing in the Mediterranean. When we talk about, you know, the banking sector and the umbrella for Greece and Spain and Portugal and whatsoever, it's a ridiculous amount of money that's needed here. And the Italians, you know, with all due respect, they've really tried to use the refugee issue also to keep a clout on the European Union, because I don't want to use the term blackmail here, but you know, it makes Italy more important in the context of the 28 member states.
And the Greeks have been far more blunt in trying to use refugees in recent days to achieve their financial goals.
But they cut off, you mentioned the overland route. They cut off this overland route. And one of the reasons why we have this disaster is because people cannot cross overland anymore into the European Union, because they have built a big fence and they're patrolling this fence. So of course the European Union has to react to this. I think this is one step. But this is, you know, otherwise, and I'm not the first one to mention this, Europe could be taken to an international court for denial of assistance if they don't take care of these people. And I think the foreign ministers have this in mind.
Speaking of denial of assistance, Houssam Aldeen, one of the things that astonished me when I've read about some of the cases of the past few years is that private citizens who try to rescue people in distress, migrants in distress, can be prosecuted for aiding and abetting human smuggling.
Yes, that's true, actually. Yeah, but I would like to just to mention something very important. Like last year, I made like a reportage about Lampedusa issue. It's very important. I would like to mention a long time ago.
Let's just remind people what that was. It was, of course, the foundering of a boat with 350 people near the Italian island of Lampedusa.
Yeah, I made a reportage with one girl. She was 18 years old, lost 9 members of her family. Half of them they die in Malta, the other half in Italy. And the problem, I was asking many people who was in the same boat, and they told me, we try to ask for help. The Maltan government says, no, go to Italy. And the Italians say, go to Malta. So everybody trying to run away from responsibilities. And what I would like to mention about, it's that we are talking a lot about human rights, and Europeans, they're trying to help, and they're like refugees, but they are trying to run away from, like, you know, their responsibilities. That's a very important issue, actually.
So disunity, one problem clearly that you raised, Johannes Leithäuser, but let's look at the approach as a whole, because what we can see from the 10-point plan that was introduced at the beginning of this week indicates that the EU is essentially bolstering the same approach it's been using since Mare Nostrum was ended, which is an approach that essentially sees migration as a problem of criminality, essentially criminalizing both human traffickers and migrants. Under the new 10-point plan, migrants will now be fingerprinted, for example. Smugglers' boats are supposed to be destroyed. There's talk about trying to do border control processing in other countries, say Northern African countries. Is an approach that essentially focuses on criminality really the right approach?
I think you have to look at these things because it has turned out to be a huge business by now, and even overtaking drug smuggling in some extent. So I think it would be incomplete not to look at these things, but it can only be one part of a larger action. And the main thing is, apart from rescuing people risking their lives or preventing them from risk their lives, is how do we deal with them, not only because they've already landed at our shores, but because we know they want to come to our shores. And we don't have even a legal framework Europe-wide what to do. And I think this has to be put in place immediately, because that's the precondition that we could send some officers somewhere to Italy or Sicily, or maybe to some other countries, maybe to Lebanon or where else, and say, look, that's your issue, we would accept you under these conditions. So we need a European asylum
But you know, I have been hearing that for probably 10 years now, covering this area. 10 years that people have been calling for a framework, and then the graph kind of looks like this. There's another tragedy, and then the calls get louder, and then...
Sure.
Daniel Gerlach, what has to happen for it to really occur?
You know, to tackle this issue with police or law enforcement means is vain, because we've tried this with drug smugglers. I mean, Johannes brought up the example. If there is a consumer market, if there is a demand, there will never be a way to prevent people from smuggling drugs and selling them, and it's only going to make the business flourish. So I can give you a few examples what I personally witnessed in Greece, for example, on the island of Lesbos. Refugees arrived, and the smugglers gave the steering wheel to one of the refugees and left. So one of the Syrians, in this case, who came to the shore, was persecuted by the police as the actual smuggler, because he had been operating, like technically operating the boat. We have seen other spectacular examples, dramatic examples of big ships being hired, and then they put thousands of refugees on these ships, and they abandon the boat, and the boat is floating towards the coast of Italy. Of course, you know, one person needs to be held accountable by the police, but nobody was basically operating the ships. So there's always ways of circumventing,
sure,
you know, persecution.
But you would think, I mean, if people are operating this industry on such a scale, that's organized crime in a higher form. And so I think there is an obligation to try and keep this down and follow the organizers and the people behind it.
At the same time, morally, is it organized crime? Morally, I mean, we're speaking in legal terms.
Yeah.
But to be honest, is a person? I've discussed this with many smugglers in Tunisia, for example. You know, they said, we're doing something good. We're helping these people. And if you look at what's going on in Libya at the moment, you know, I've just quote the example of 20 Ethiopian Christians allegedly being executed on the beach in Libya. These African migrants that have stranded in Libya, they have to fear for their lives. They're not only, they came for economic reasons, but now all of a sudden they are really, their lives are threatened. And if somebody takes them over to the European shores, is he really committing a crime? Is this organized crime?
Let's put that question directly to Houssam Aldeen, whose parents obviously, or relatives obviously, did deal with traffickers. Would you say that the assistance to migrants who want to cross illegally is like smuggling? Is this war on migration like a war on drugs, or is it something entirely different?
Of course, those people, in my opinion, they are criminals, and they are taking advantage of many people. For example, each boat they earn at least in one day like $1 million minimum. Like when you get 700 people or 900 people in one boat, they get from each one 1,000, 1,500 euro each one. So they are just like trading with the people, with a human being. I mean, they put them in the risk. If they die, they don't care, actually.
And yet, without them, your family couldn't have made the crossing.
Well, I was against that, but because my family, they don't have another option. We don't have really income, and also like in Jordan, they had a really difficult time. Egypt, they don't welcome to Syrians. Turkey, very difficult for refugees. Lebanon, it's quite impossible. Nobody wants Syrians. Even Somalia, they ask for visa for Syrians. So even if when they went to Algeria, they have to have everyone $3,000 in as a pocket money. And now you need a visa to, you know, to enter to enter Algeria. So it's quite impossible. So they don't find any solution, like a good solution, like you have to risk with your life, like 50%. If you survive, you're safe. If you don't survive, so you have nothing to lose anymore.
So let me ask you another point that Daniel Gerlach brought up. How effective will any of this be, leaving aside the moral issue of whether traffickers are essentially providing a service that is in some way humanitarian, or whether in fact they are simply exploiting misery? What about the effectiveness? Let me just remind us of some of the measures that are now being taken by the EU. Destroying human traffickers' boats, stronger policing in the Mediterranean, tighter border controls, quicker deportation measures for illegal immigrants, and apparently the likelihood of some border processing in other countries where migrants, the midway stations for them. All of that's being talked about. Would any of it change the flow? Would any of it actually decrease the attempt of refugees to come?
Well, that's a big issue actually, but maybe I have the only suggestion that's why only Europe they have to take these responsibilities. Why not all around the world? They're like America, like New Zealand, Australia, or Gulf country even, they can help with that. We only mentioned that European, they have to take the responsibility, but that's not enough. Even inside Europe, there's a big conflict. For example, France, they are not taking the responsibility, or like UK also, they are not taking this. Mostly like Germany or like Scandinavian or Netherlands, they are taking some responsibilities. But why we don't make a balance? It's as you mentioned.
I want to come back to that aspect, the worldwide refugee situation, in just a moment. But you mentioned Australia. Australia is one of the models that the current EU policy is often compared to. Australia adopted a stop the boats policy a couple of years ago, and many people say it has been effective. Johannes Leithäuser, it has a number of the elements we're talking about, including processing of would-be migrants' applications in other countries, in essentially Pacific countries that could be countries of transit. Is that a good scheme? Is it working?
I don't think it would work in Europe just for geographical reasons. I mean, what the Australians did was they shipped them off, the refugees they picked out of the sea, to small islands, and in effectively detaining them there and dealing with their matters there. That wouldn't work in the Mediterranean or on the southern shores of Europe, and we wouldn't be ready, I think, to adopt this policy as well. Let alone, again, I have to repeat this, there is no Europe acting like the state Australia is acting, so there would have to be set many preconditions.
Say, fortunately, there's
yes,
not, because the Australian example is dreadful, is shameful,
yes.
And if Europe ever accepted like any of that solution, I think it would be scandalous.
Tell us
so
why,
in this,
because it is a model that's being mentioned very frequently now. Why is it dreadful and scandalous?
Well, do you want Europe to pay the neighboring countries in the southern Mediterranean, just like, you know, left aside the instability of these countries, pay them for detaining the refugees? Because that's what's happening in Australia.
We had a deal like that with Gaddafi's Libya before.
Exactly, and Gaddafi said, he said it in one of his last speeches, if you think that you can topple me, then you will see what's going to happen. You know, migrants will flood Europe. He predicted that. You know, and this was actually a way of blackmailing the Europeans. We have a moral issue here, and we have, you know, do we want to behave like a rogue state? Do we want to behave like Australia? Of course, we have like 28 governments that are constantly running election campaigns. But we should not follow this example. I've just would like to remind you of this campaign. You won't make Australia, or you won't make this country your home. You know, this is shameful, and we should not, you know, even out of tactical or practical reasons, ever try to imitate such a system.
And I mean, there are different things coming in. Australia, at least, has a history of being a country welcoming immigrants, and you can see what happened to them now. In Europe, you have 28 different backgrounds. Germany, for many, many years, claimed to be not a country for economic immigrants, kein Einwanderungsland. Other countries have been colonial powers, for instance, like France and Britain. So they are used to a multicultural society in different ways or are not used to completely. That's the first precondition we have to bring together and draw a line and said, look, we have to find some common principles about how we want to deal with immigration, what kind of people do we want to accept, how about our moral obligations, and how far will we go. And this is just, well, in the beginnings.
And we have to be honest about the reasons of asylum, because we are forcing, left aside the Syrians, everybody understands that there is a war going on and that people are dying every day. But many other refugees are coming and we force them to lie. We force them to tell that they seek political asylums because they are being persecuted in their countries and they have to fear for their lives. Obviously, this is not true. Many refugees are coming because they have just one life and they want to live a better life. So they're making up causes, and we force them to make up these causes because otherwise they would face a criminal investigation or being sent back to their countries. So let's be honest about what reasons do people travel for.
Let us take a closer look at some of those reasons. You mentioned the breakdown of Libya and Gaddafi's threat. Libya's disintegration, like that of much of the Middle East, does provide one reason for why this problem has become so urgent. Let's take a look.
Although Libya is overwhelmed, officials occasionally make efforts to stem the flood of refugees. Last week, they detained hundreds of migrants after a series of raids. But the scale of the problem is much larger.
We fear that in the coming period, if the state does not intervene decisively and effectively, if the humanitarian organizations and nations concerned with combating illegal migration do not stand together as one and provide us with the necessary resources, a major humanitarian crisis could occur.
Many would say it already is occurring. For migrants from poverty-stricken countries devastated by war like Somalia and Eritrea, the dangers of the journey hold few fears.
I was a student living and studying in Somalia. My country is at war and is good for nothing. So I chose to travel to Europe, and may God bless me with good fortune.
All we've left behind us is death, death, death. There's no food. Ethiopia is no good. Europe is good.
And though some of them will be detained on the North African shore, many more will make it to Europe or die trying.
Houssam Aldeen, you mentioned it a bit earlier. We talk about this at the moment as if it's a European problem, but it is absolutely a worldwide problem, isn't it? People in the UN High Commissioner for Refugees office are saying the entire system by which we have tried to cope with refugees since World War II is breaking down.
Yes, that's true. Actually, there's a lot of countries like running away from the, this responsibilities. Like United States, they're talking a lot about refugees, how to support them, how to help them. But look at the numbers. How many refugees they have? Canadian,
I think around 500 last I saw.
More than that. France also, they were talking a lot about refugees and helping, especially Syrian people and blah, blah, blah. But you cannot just check the numbers. It's just a few thousand, not more than that. I mean, compared to many countries.
But look at the Latin American context when you talk about America. We know many examples where Syrians and other Iraqis, Middle Eastern refugees made it to Mexico, even like legally made it to Mexico, and then they illegally migrated from Mexico to the United States, and they have been they've been granted asylum. They have been accepted easily. So I think we should not only blame the United States here. They are of course.
They can make settlements.
They could do more.
Like Iraqi refugees, for example, they can make it like settlement. Like they can. People apply like legally, actually. Why like illegal way? I mean, who can like get to United States? It's quite impossible, and has a lot of money, and there
is a very unglobal thinking
to Mexico, and it's high risk. Maybe they die with the smugglers there.
I want to say there's a very unglobal thinking for a very global problem. Still, and it was recently mentioned in a primetime talk show here in Germany. That the refugees should somehow stay in the region where the conflict emerged. So what's the responsibility of Turkey or Lebanon or Jordan? In which way is it higher than our responsibility to deal with the Syrian conflict, just because they happen to be in the neighborhood?
Let us remember that, in fact, they have taken in hundreds of thousands, some of them millions of refugees already. Johannes Leithäuser, what kind of numbers are we talking about here? Let's say we could get some sort of rational international approach. How many would have to be resettled in order to defuse the pressure?
I think it's impossible to say. There are the wildest of estimations on every scale. The German Minister for the Interior just said there would be 1 million people waiting on the southern shores of the Mediterranean for a crossing. How many inhabitants has Syria, and how many are living in the refugee camps in Jordan or Lebanon, where they are at the moment, but that's not the durable solution for them. So even those that are housed somewhere for the time being have to be dealt with. And I think I wanted to add just this idea of keeping them in the region is, I think, the very naive hope that the neighboring countries could deal with the underlying problems, and that's, of course, the thing we would have to talk as well. Who's taking responsibility for the conflicts in the Middle East, and who's taking care of Africa? The Americans are no longer willing to do it to a large extent, so it will be left to Europe to do this. And I don't think we are prepared to go into a deeper policy towards Africa.
Houssam Aldeen, when you look at the refugees you're working with, both within the association, the project that you're working with, and also your own family, how many actually have the intention, the desire to remain here, to remain in Europe? Do most hope to go back one day?
Well, I can tell you 70–80% would like to come back because they
like to go back to their...
Because, you know, they don't feel like home here. They are forced to come here, not because they choose it or because it's my dream to get to Europe or something like that. People really has a special relation with the nation, with the land, with the country, with the people. They would like to come back mostly, actually. It's not their dream to get here and to start again from zero and to learn the language and to be with the society. It's quite very difficult for them, actually.
Immigration experts, of course, Daniel Gerlach, refer to that as circularity, the idea that you take in refugees for some amount of time, immigrants for some amount of time, and then facilitate a return to their home countries. Working with that concept, does that make it any easier to adopt a liberalizing approach either within Europe or internationally to refugee and migration issues?
Well, it would probably be easier to sell it by using this concept to sell it to the public. But I don't think it's a sustainable concept. I think, you know, in the 1960s and 70s, we had a mass migration across the Mediterranean. People boarded ferry boats. And I think a UN representative recently quoted this example. They boarded ferry boats, they didn't drown in the Mediterranean. Of course, the situation today is different, and the reasons why people come are multiple. But I think we have to be honest with ourselves and say either we pay the price of letting people drown. I don't think that it's going to stop. Even if we apply a you know, comprehensive approach, people will still die on the Mediterranean because we cannot deal with all these individual cases at a time. We cannot put everybody on a ferry boat and just mass ship them to Europe. But there needs to be some control. But I think beyond that, and this might be even a taboo, but I think it's worth discussing it, if everybody wants to come to Europe, because Europe is the only safe place around the Mediterranean, then obviously there's something with the concept of citizenship and there's something wrong with the concept of borders. I think the fairest way would be to discuss that Europe should take responsibility and maybe also control of some parts on the southern Mediterranean shore. I think this is, it sounds, you know, people would come up and say, well, this is neo-colonial, why should Europeans all of a sudden control the south of the Mediterranean? But if states fall apart, there need to be buffer zones, and honestly, I think in Libya, a military intervention is needed, and you know, I know the Italians and the French are ready for this. And sooner or later, they have to create some kind of buffer zone there where people could seek refuge. and not let the responsibility of camps on the other side of the Mediterranean, as they did with Gaddafi and other dictators, and just like basically have detention or concentration camps in the desert of Libya, but control these protected areas themselves.
Johannes Leithäuser, Libya is now falling apart, partly because Europe did lead on the airstrikes in Libya, but certainly there was no leadership of any kind from anyone in terms of reconstructing the country afterward.
Germans didn't take part, but said to the others, "We told you so," afterwards, which was not very helpful as well.
So are we likely to see any political will, either in Europe or internationally, to move forward with the kind of scheme that Daniel Gerlach?
I would agree with Daniel. I see this necessity as well, but I don't think there's hardly any appetite to take political responsibility for that. We just had this huge Afghanistan experience, trying nation building with all kind of idealistic imaginations first, and we're not very satisfied with the outcome. The politicians still claim it has been a success, but we're not so sure. And I don't think we would be more successful in Libya because the region is so unstable. We would invite all kinds of Islamistic terrorists to Libya if we set a foot on this ground, because then they had an example to show how they blow up those bloody Westerners. So it is very, very difficult, but it comes back to the question, who's taking responsibility for Africa? And so we have if this goes on and on, what we experience now, and we are still in this moral dilemma that, I mean, there's even this cynical notion, the more fragile the vessels are, those traffickers set the people in, the more likely they are to be rescued, because when you're in immediate distress, every ship going by has to help you. If these ships are looking stable enough to make the journey between Italy and Malta 10 times, then they are more likely to be sent from one direction to the other. All this.
Everything comes with a price. Of course, what I just suggested comes with a very high price and with a very high risk. But we have to be honest about the alternatives we have. Either we do it this way, or we do it that way, or we leave everything as it is, and we will see more people drown. And some people are ready to accept this. They say we have made our choice, and it comes with the price that every now and then a couple of hundred people will drown in the Mediterranean. Let's be honest. This is what's going to happen.
Let me ask about another aspect of political feasibility. Many people say we will not see a liberalizing approach to immigration that actually sets realistic conditions for legal immigration for people in political as well as economic distress because of the political situation in Western Europe at the moment, namely the rise of right-wing, anti-immigrant, anti-EU parties. Houssam Aldeen, have you felt that kind of anti-immigrant sentiment here as an exile in Berlin?
Well, kind of. I have maybe because I used to come to Europe a lot, and I was working with like Iraqi refugees. I faced these problems actually for also other refugees. For me, not so much, but a lot of like refugees, they had these problems actually.
So do you think it's right, Johannes Leithäuser, that also is one reason why we are seeing the EU essentially stay with a muddling through containment and policing approach?
Yes, of course. I mean, all these politicians look at their own constituencies first and at their own jobs as well. But there are many different elements forming this policy. For instance, Germany, at least, is economically successful at the moment. We need workers for certain branches. So there's a counterbalance here. The economy is saying, look, you have to take people in because we need them for the jobs. We are aging society as well. We can't reproduce the people we need to keep up our economy. So I think this all forms the discussion here. But you have other countries, like in Finland, for instance, there has been a success of the far-right party just at the moment. And again, they all make up Europe, and they all take part in forming European policy.
And even here, Daniel Gerlach, you told us earlier, well, the media are telling the story. Yeah. There is empathy there. And yet we've seen proposed residences for refugees burned down in a town in eastern Germany. We've seen massive marches in Dresden by people who say they want to stop Islamization, also, of course, through refugees from the Middle East. So even here in Germany, with a strong economy, with the media trying to tell the story, doesn't seem like there's a lot of willingness to take in legal migrants.
Well, of course, there's always a couple of 100,000 spoilers. There's always going to be, you know, a minority that you cannot approach, that you cannot talk to, that is not interested in the world. But burning down this example you mentioned, when a refugee home was burned before actually the refugees could move in. This happened also before in Germany. This happened in the 1990s and the 2000s, and there was not much talking about it because it was not such a big issue, but it happened before. Of course, these problems exist, but I don't see that a major right-wing political movement is going to benefit from this issue. And I also think that, in a way, you know, it's also a pretext for politicians to say, well, we cannot address this issue too thoroughly because it's going to you know, encourage the right-wing movements and right-wing parties in our countries. We see that the success of right-wing movements in Europe is not majorly, I'd say, due to the you know, immigration policies. There are other issues which are much more prevalent and much more important at the moment. It's always one issue, and you know, this connection between between Islam, the topic of Islam, and the so-called Islamization and refugees is just like artificial. You know, it's not there just for the reason that many of these refugees are Muslims. This has nothing to do with Islam or Islamization at all. So I think people should not be perceived as a threat. They should be perceived also as a potential. But if they are if they're getting on these boats, they will become traumatized with this experience they have. They will be traumatized, and they will be much more a problem than if we just, you know, put them on a ferry boat.
Houssam Aldeen, a couple of years ago, there was a film that basically portrayed a massive movement of millions of people coming from the Middle East and Northern Africa. Many people say, oh, this is just a horrible nightmare. It's not true. Do you think that's right? Is this just, is this the beginning of a huge tide?
Well, I think so. We'll start it soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. See you soon.